Değer yaratmanın formülü. Tasarım odaklı düşünme.
This is Mete Yurtsever, host of the Formula for Creating Value podcast. And joining us today are two renowned cognitive scientists who have dedicated their careers to unraveling the mysteries of human perception and decision making. First, we have Daniel Simons, a professor of psychology at the University of Illinois. Daniel is best known for his pioneering work on inattentional blindness and visual awareness, most famously demonstrated in the invisible gorilla experiment, which revealed how we often overlook obvious details in our environment. His research not only transformed our understanding of attention and awareness, but also highlighted the surprising limits of human perception, making him a leading authority in the field of cognitive psychology. Next, we have Christopher Chabris, a professor at Geisinger and an accomplished researcher in the fields of cognitive psychology, behavioral economics, and decision-making. Christopher has contributed significantly to our understanding of how biases shape human thinking, co-authoring the bestseller, The Invisible Gorilla, which examines everyday cognitive illusions. His work spans both academic research and applied settings, offering insights into how these mental shortcuts affect our real-world decisions, from daily choices to critical judgments. Together, they have written Nobody's Fool, a compelling exploration of human vulnerability to deception and how we can outsmart the tricks our minds play on us. It's an honor to have them both here today. Welcome, Daniel and Christopher.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Well, thanks for accepting my invitation. I think we should start with the inevitable question. In 2004, you both received an Ig Nobel Prize for your groundbreaking work on the invisible gorilla experiment, which brilliantly illustrates the limits of human attention. For those unfamiliar, could you briefly explain what is the Ig Nobel Prize and what it was like to receive this award?
Yeah, so the Ig Nobel Prize is not like the Nobel Prize. It's a prize for research that first makes you laugh and then makes you think. Right? So it has to have a little bit of sort of humor element to it. So when you put people in a gorilla suit and as part of your research, that fits. So the award was for a study that we did many years ago, about 25 years ago now, where we had people watch a video and they were just given a simple task, like count how many times the players wearing white shirts pass a basketball and complete a pass. And they move around each other and fake passes and that sort of thing. And then there are also 3 players wearing black shirts passing their own ball, and you're supposed to just ignore their passes. And as you're doing this task, which we can do quite well, a person wearing a full gorilla costume walks into the scene, turns and faces the camera, thumps his chest, and then walks off the other side about 8 or 9 seconds later. And what we find is about half the people who watch this video and are counting the passes don't notice the person in the gorilla suit. And the critical aspect of this isn't just that people fail to notice it, it's that most people are really convinced that of course they would notice something that obvious, that big. And that's really the thing that we're most interested in and that we wrote our first book about, was those sorts of mistaken beliefs about how our own minds work. The mistaken idea, in this case, that something that's really important will automatically grab our attention and we'll become aware of it, when in reality, we often don't know how much we're missing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Christopher, how this having this award, how did it affect your career or your life?
Well, I think it did, actually, because not only was it great fun and a lot of people heard about this experiment and heard about me and so on as a result of it. They get good publicity. The Ig Nobel Prizes sort of always get good publicity. But I think it was actually while walking away from the theater, that day that Dan and I first started talking about writing a book. And it took us a little while after that, but eventually we came out with our first book in 2010, and that definitely affected, I would say, probably both of our careers. It's great to be able to try to translate science for the general public, and especially science that we think, at least I think, is so applicable sort of every day of our lives, and a lot of people weren't necessarily aware of and still aren't aware of. And that's part of what the new book is about, is extending that to an increasing problem in the modern world of, people deliberately trying to trick us as opposed to just accidental mistakes that we make. Then we have a whole other level of people trying to get us to make mistakes in their own interests, right? That's the next level in a way.
Yeah. So let's move on to the book then. So we have here the Trojan horse, and this is the land of Trojan horse. It's in current Turkey in Çanakkale.
Yeah.
So maybe because of that, it raised the question in me about cultural differences in susceptibility to deceit. So in your research and your writing of Nobody's Fool, did you find any evidence suggesting that Eastern cultures might be more inclined either to deceive or to believe without questioning things compared to Western cultures? Although, yes, your book doesn't have this Eastern part, but maybe your research or let's say your studies revealed something like this. So does human susceptibility to deception more universally distributed, and what's the story's role actually in this Eastern and Western?
Yeah, I can start with that. I
Yeah,
think,
please.
I think we view, and I think I speak for Chris in this way too, that I think we view the sorts of cognitive tendencies and habits that we discuss in the book as somewhat universal to just thought processes, because they rely on how we sort of interact and have to interact in the world to make sense of the world. So one way to think about this is it's impossible for us to go through life being completely skeptical of every tidbit we hear from anybody. It's impossible. You have to accept the truth of what people are saying to some extent in order to have any sort of a society. And it doesn't really matter what kind of society that is. We have to be at least somewhat willing to accept that when you're interacting with somebody, they're telling you the truth, at least at first. And you can't sort of go through life questioning every statement, every sign, every message that you hear, because you could never make any progress. So a consequence of that is that when we are willing to accept the truth of what somebody's saying, somebody who's looking to deceive us can take advantage of that by keeping us focused on what they've said and not giving us a chance to question it. And those sorts of cognitive tendencies tend to be pretty universal, in the same way that when you show people a video with a person in a gorilla suit in it, that applies everywhere in the world. It's not just something that is limited to, college undergraduates or some set of particularly clueless people or anything like that. I think the one kind of theme that we tried to strike, or one of the couple of themes that we tried to strike throughout the book, was that deception works not just because people are gullible or clueless. And sure, there might be some individual differences in how willing people are to accept sort of implausible promises, but everybody is susceptible to deception if they're the ones who are targeted.
And Christopher, I mean, do you think really to my mind, I mean, as a being from somewhere in between, closer to Eastern and between, because Turkey is considered to be a bridge between East and West, right? So, but really there are stories. I mean, we are more storytelling kind, I would say, in the Eastern. I mean, if you think about the Arabian Nights, or okay, we are not Arabian being the whole representative of Eastern world, but I mean, we tend to maybe hear and count more on stories, or not? Do you have such a perception as a Westerner?
I'm not a cultural psychologist, but I think every culture has its stories, and human nature is to be convinced by stories perhaps more than we should, especially when there is an alternative source of information, like, scientific experiments or numerical evidence from large, data sets and so on. The kind of things that didn't exist, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, and so on. To me, the biggest cultural difference, I think, is sort of the content of the deceptions and the stories. Different things will be convincing to different people based on their cultural backgrounds and their assumptions. So we have this concept in the book we call commitment, which are sort of like strong beliefs or assumptions you have about the world that you don't even know you don't articulate them to yourself, but you're sort of, they're baked into the way you think about things. And those could be very religiously oriented, or they could just be based on experience or based on sort of cultural scripts and so on. And a clever deceiver, a clever scammer, will know like what you might be most likely to believe in automatically, and how easily you can be convinced to believe one more thing, and so on, perhaps based on your cultural background, religion, and so on. Also, there are a lot of sadly, a lot of scams target people who are immigrants or outsiders, in a country, or a place because they don't necessarily have the expertise in how things work. So it might be easier to convince them to believe some nonsense, like like the government collects unpaid tax bills by having you buy gift cards, at Walmart or the gas station and read the numbers over the phone to some guy in India. Like
Uh-huh.
that is, that doesn't work that way, right? But like if you're not, steeped in the way things do work your whole life in the country you're in, you might fall for it. And well, not millions, but many people have, like exactly that
Sure.
one that I just described. As crazy as it might sound, just to hear it described,
Uh-huh.
some people might find it completely credible, or at least long enough to fall into it.
I see. I see. True.
Your question about narratives and stories is an
Mhm.
interesting one because
Mhm.
a lot of how we reason is based on stories and anecdotes and narratives. And that's partly because we're so quick to generalize from a single case or a single demonstration or example to all related things.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
you see a technology demo and you assume that it works in all situations and that it always works, and that's not true, right? So a lot of that sort of advertising or narrative or persuasion attempts are based on telling a story and assuming that people will generalize from it. So I don't think that that's necessarily an East-West difference. I think that's pretty central
True.
to how we reason.
True. Then, okay, let's move on to stories to movies. So there are movies like Catch Me If You Can, The Sting, the Ocean's 11, and that captivate us by showcasing clever deception and the thrill of fooling others. Do you think this fascination stems from a form of catharsis, like where viewers find a sense of release or satisfaction in witnessing deception from a safe distance? Or is it something more like identifying with the cleverness of the deceivers themselves?
That's a really good question. I hadn't thought about the catharsis angle before, but I think certainly one thing about these films, like you mentioned, Ocean's 11 and The Sting, what's going on in those films is so complicated that, it almost never happens in the real world. I don't want to say never because, we have come across some stories where it almost seems like, entire sort of business enterprises were kind of set up that were fake, kind of like in The Sting, there's a whole fake betting parlor,
Yeah.
and so on. But they're very rare. Like that's not representative of how most people are deceived most of the time,
Sure.
even when big money is at stake, right? Like usually there's not something that involved. But I think, the growing popularity or the seemingly growing popularity of documentaries about scams, movies with deceptions, and so on does suggest um, that we are interested in understanding them and that we like to consume them sort of backwards, like from the end point, knowing that there's a scam involved, then we like being able to see how it unfolds and to see, oh, like they should have noticed this, what a dumb thing they did. Like this was obviously a fake offer, and so on. And that can lead us, I think, into a false sense of security because when you see it, when you see it after it's all over, everything seems obvious. And
Yeah.
it makes us sort of laugh even more at people who are actual victims, perhaps, not thinking that, it could happen to us or that they're stupid or something like that. So it's great. It's great culture, right? Great movies, great documentaries and so on. But one reason why we wrote this book was to give I would say a fairer view of like how this happens and what are the real patterns, and
Mhm.
what are the things that you could do as opposed to just imagine like all the signs are obvious, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah. And that's part of the question is, yes, people follow these, people watch these all the time, and yet we don't seem to still
Yeah,
know
we're
how
still
to
getting
avoid
scammed.
scams. Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
people who've seen The Sting and Ocean's 11 are getting scammed,
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
that's
true, true. Yeah, although they are okay, Hollywood movies and they're really full of all these storytelling techniques and everything, but yeah, definitely we don't take lessons. So actually, my following question is, I'm not sure. It's not fair to think that you would have an answer to this, but I would still ask. In the book, you discuss the deceptive nature of the small lettered agreements and that we encounter daily, right? So when they're dealing with this monopolistic services like Gmail or Spotify, whatever, so you have to click this and do this, whatever. So in situations like this, what individuals can realistically how they can protect themselves. Actually, it's so there's. Don't you think it's also like this is the duty of the authorities to take care of us of users? I mean, this is not really like okay, this is more of a systematic question. But what do you think about this?
Chris, do you want to start or should I?
You can go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I was going to say, it is kind of unfair to assume that a typical user of Gmail or some other service is going to have any way of understanding the terms of service, right? It's a lot of legalese in that, and you're agreeing to different kinds of arbitration in different locations. And realistically, very few people actually look at those because they want to use the service, and they're not trained to evaluate that. So could corporations take advantage of you? Yeah, of course. And I think you're right that is a place where somebody other than the individual user has to be responsible for making sure that those sorts of terms are fair, that they're reasonable, because it's not something that an individual is going to be able to deal with. That said, more often than not, they're just a safety net for the companies and aren't really going to have that many consequences. But people are pretty willing to wave away their privacy rights and their content and don't think too much of it and probably figure it's not that big a deal. And I think it's arguable whether it is actually a big deal.
Yeah, because this comes to the question of this opportunity cost. I mean, like, we don't really think that, is there really an alternative to this? I mean, like, do I really have to comply with all these things, nonsense, whatever, or sometimes, because they don't always have to be so huge services or vital services like Gmail or whatever, but there are small things that we really accept without really thinking. So that should also raise a question. Yeah.
And it's a real challenge. I mean, there are, at the regulatory level, there are attempts to kind of protect privacy. The EU has an entire system allowing people to, have their data removed from services. The United States doesn't really have that to the same extent. But yeah, it's not clear what the resolution to that is.
Yeah. Christopher, you had something to say?
I think there's a role potentially for some third-party organization, NGO type organization, to maybe do ratings, like on how fair are the terms of service of different services and so on. There are companies which rate businesses in the U.S. They're nonprofit companies that rate for-profit businesses. There are, and it's related to this idea also that if you wanted to know whether you were dealing with someone who was likely to be a fraudster, it would be nice if you could look them up and see have they ever been convicted of fraud or sued for fraud and found liable, and so how about like a service where you could look up like what are the red flags in Gmail's terms of service, or in more to the point maybe in some of these AI products, right? Like what are you agreeing to give them and to let them do?
Exactly.
Sometimes it might really matter. Like you're pouring your intellectual property that you're intending to like live your life off of into some other company, or sometimes it might not matter. You're just chatting, with something and you don't care, but it should be easy to find out, right? So maybe some third party, organization could help with that. I think there needs, I really do think after working on this book that there need to be more sort of nonprofit resources invested in helping people avoid, being scammed and defrauded.
Exactly. So that's like they mention about Mustafa Süleyman mentions about red team for AI. I mean, like there should be some people with some resources to work on these things. Yeah, I totally agree. So one thing that struck me in the book, I always thought that this election campaign banners, flags, the similar street advertising are largely waste of money and also like polluting everything. But your research suggests otherwise, which puzzled me. And so do these traditional campaign tactics actually have a measurable impact on voters? And if so, how do they work in shaping decisions in such a complex environment, I would say?
I mean, we're not political scientists. We don't, so we were reporting other people's work on these sorts of topics. I think the thing to keep in mind is, some of those tactics have some effect, and it might be measurable, but it doesn't mean it's massive. And so putting up yard signs might shift a percentage of voting, a percentage point or so, which could be huge in a very tight election. But it's not putting a sign in your yard isn't going to swing an election by 10%.
Right.
Briefly flashing, the politician's name isn't going to radically change your vote for them. So yeah, you can find some effects, but you have to keep in mind that, the odds of those pushing somebody's decisions around by a huge amount is not too likely. They're going to be small effects.
Yeah.
But in some cases, when something scales up, a small effect can have a big difference if it's a very close decision.
True.
Yeah. It's not going to matter if it's 20% victory, right? It's not going to have any effect at all.
Yeah.
Probably is going to make more of a difference if in a little known election, right? So like if I put up a Trump sign, is there anybody who hasn't heard of Trump? But if I put up a sign for someone running for the local school board, right, which is an election that maybe people don't pay that much attention to, that might have some effect. But the most important thing is that like these are really small effects, right? Like Dan was saying, and they teach us not to be deceived when someone says, "Oh, there's some kind of psychological trick that can produce a huge effect." Right? Because if even all these signs that people see every day and so on can't really move the needle that much, how much would like the wording of one message, that you see once during the entire election, like really matter? It's a very cumulative process, right? There's no magic words, that get everybody to do exactly what you want, despite what people might say.
Yeah. If there were, people would have been doing that a long time and it would have been having huge effects on the election, and then they'd be countering each other with different words, right? It's kind of a general principle that, big effects require really, really big interventions, and trivial little interventions, even things that we see a lot of, don't tend to have giant effects.
Cool. And another point was from your book was this popular saying that there's no such thing as good or bad advertising. So implying that any attention is beneficial, I say. Based on your research, so this is how this holds true. And is there certain types of advertising actually backfire and harm a brand or campaign?
Wow. Okay. I'm sure the answer is yes. But it's not necessarily easy to predict in advance. And when it comes to deception, right? One important element of deception is it works better when the victims or the targets are already familiar with the message and the messenger, right? So even a lot of negative publicity or publicity that some people might think is negative about someone or something builds up a familiarity, right, in the future audiences, right? So I've experienced it myself that like there's a politician who I don't really, believe in, but they say something enough times, I start to wonder, and I sort of at the same time, I wonder, why am I wondering, but the fact that I'm wondering, whether maybe they're right, I've heard it a lot of times, this source is very familiar and so on. It creates a bit of a psychological challenge, when you've got like sort of familiar sources, even if you know about them because of not the greatest things, are sending messages. So when they say like there's no such thing as bad publicity, I think partly, we would argue what they mean is that it builds up familiarity in the audience so that then your message might be more likely to be perceived, more likely to be seen as credible, even if it shouldn't be.
Another thing in the book I came across, and which is very like a common thing, these scam emails we receive, like you can win this $10 million to things like this. So I came across another one like a couple of months ago, and I also shared on LinkedIn that even the translation was so weird and bad. The Turkish translation of it, the mail started like "Hello dear." So it's like, "Hello, dear Mr. Yurtsever," maybe, whatever, but without that. And there were mistakes with, the signing name, and the people who sent it was different. So I'm thinking, why they don't really perfect this? Why they don't just check it out with some people? I mean, isn't it worth the effort? I mean, or as in your book you say, every 7 person clicks such mails, right? I mean, it's
lots of people get those emails. I mean, we all still do. I still get them regularly. Mostly Gmail is pretty good at filtering them, but you still see them. And, there's a couple of reasons why they might actually have those errors in them. One is that they might have originally been designed that way in order to bypass spam filters. But spam filters are pretty good at that, catching those sorts of things now. But another reason might be strategic, right? That it's really cheap to send out a huge number of emails to a huge number of people. And it's really costly and time consuming for a scammer like that to interact with people and try and get them to send money. So the less time they can spend interacting with people who are never going to send them money, who would never be fooled by that sort of an email, from their perspective, the better. Right? So if you get that email and you say, oh, yeah, this makes no sense, it's terribly translated, the greeting makes no sense, the signature is weird, there's lots of typos and grammar mistakes, you're just going to delete it. But somebody who in that moment is maybe a little more desperate or a little less familiar with that sort of a scam, might be newer to being online, who might be in a situation where they say, huh, that sounds interesting, let me respond to it. Well, they've just self-selected themselves as a possible victim. Right? And
so they're, sorry,
yeah, it's a selection. It can be a selection tool. They want to filter out anybody who might know it's a scam, right? And only the people who, it might be a very tiny percentage, right? Again, this is one of those cases where a very small effect, you can reach a very small subset of 10 million people. But if you get $1,000 from each of 10 million, each of a small subset of 10 million people, that's still a lot of money. So it's cost effective for them to try and reel people in without necessarily doing that. So it might actually be deliberate now to have those sorts of typos, because it'd be pretty easy to actually correct those emails, and they still don't.
Another thing to keep in mind with things like that is those kind of scams are increasingly becoming just like big businesses that run off of a cheap or exploited, extremely cheap or exploited, or criminally victimized labor. And so you're not necessarily dealing with a mastermind at the other end of that email. You're dealing with someone who's probably just following a playbook that they've got from like their boss, or call center scams, these things, that a lot of them operate that way. It's very unfortunate. You almost can't blame the person at the other end of the email or something, because it's not their decision, or their, totally free choice to be doing this kind of stuff. And they're just following some other playbook that someone has decided is gonna work.
They're often victims themselves.
Yeah,
they've often been victimized and are put in a position of having no choice but to be a scammer.
That's true. Okay, so one last question before the signature question. So throughout the book, you emphasize that the critical thinking is the essential to avoid being deceived, right? But as you point out, also thinking itself can be quite a heavy burden for mental effort for for most of us. And could there be a way to use similar tools that deceivers use, like psychological triggers or shortcuts, to actually protect people from being deceived? In other words, can we turn their weapons of deception into defensive mechanisms?
I can start on that. I think one way to think about this is that a lot of the ways that people deceive us are taking advantage of our cognitive tendencies. And most of the time, those cognitive tendencies work really, really well for us. So we don't want to abandon them. Right? You don't want to abandon the ability to focus on the things you care about and ignore irrelevant information, right? That's how you get by in the world. It's the only efficient way to do it. Acting efficiently is good the vast majority of the time. So the real challenge isn't, constantly second guessing everything, being cautious about every single interaction. It's thinking about when are the times when I'm at risk, and knowing you don't really have to do all that much. All you have to do is take a step back and say, is that really true? And at times when you might be doing something that seems risky, that's the step you need to take. Just ask a couple more questions. What we're trying to do in the book is to give people a sense of what are those cognitive tendencies that we have, so that you can notice if they're coming into play, if you can notice if somebody's taking advantage of them, because the scams are going to change, right? There are going to be different forms of these scams appearing. There are going to be novel versions, but they all seem to tap into the same sort of cognitive tendencies. So if you can notice when you're being played, just enough to stop and say, wait a second, does that make sense? Or to ask somebody else to take a look at this and say, hey, does this seem genuine? That step is often enough to prevent you from falling for it. It doesn't require necessarily a lot of critical thinking. right? And
Yeah.
I'm actually not a huge fan of the term critical thinking because, even people who fall into cults can be very good critical thinkers. They just start with the wrong assumptions and commitments, and then everything else is logical from there. And they're thinking very critically about people who criticize them. We're very good at being critical of things we don't believe. We're not so great at being critical of things that we do believe. So I actually prefer the phrase cautious thinking.
Okay.
And being cautious when it matters
Mhm.
just means pausing for a second, thinking a little bit more, taking a little more time. But recognizing common scams and their forms can, be useful too.
Actually, I would ask this to Chris. I meant actually in a way distant inspiration. Let's say nudging. I mean, actually, nudge is a way of actually protecting people from these things, right? I mean, but the institutions, as we previously discussed, I mean, institutions or NGOs, whatever, should be able to maybe reinforce this in a better way.
I agree. So, the concept of a nudge is sort of a small intervention, a small thing that can help you make a decision right at the critical moment. I think there's a lot of there's a lot of misconception about how nudges work, but I think the way they really work is that they give us crucial information we need right at the time when we need it most. I think those are the most effective nudges. And so I've noticed recently, sometimes, when you get a one-time password from a website or something, the message you get says, never tell anyone this number. And then it gives you the number.
Right.
So what they're doing is they're trying to give you like information like right at the point when it might be most useful, or even for you to remember that in the future, they're giving it to you when you pay attention, which is much better than sending you an email like 10 days from now saying, here are some important safety practices to know for your bank account. Like, who reads those, right?
Yeah.
But if you're trying to get into your bank account and you need a message from the bank to get in, put in that message right there, the most critical information in the fewest number of words, and so on. I think that's an example of a simple nudge, like right on time delivery. Uh, Unfortunately, of course, a lot of the techniques of nudging are sort of the same as the techniques of deceptive marketing, right? You make things salient that
Exactly.
people shouldn't be, paying attention to, like when you buy airline tickets, like, oh, 81% of people bought the trip insurance or something like that, which is a bad deal, or you might not even need because you already have insurance or something like that. So it's a double-edged sword. Institutions should do it when it's in everyone's interest. I think a part of the answer to your question, I think, is something that Dan mentioned, which is we're really good at pattern recognition, right? Like humans are great at learning common patterns and what they mean and so on. So part of what you get out of reading our book is also just like reading about lots of different scams and seeing what they have in common. What are the patterns? Maybe even just sort of like, your pattern recognition will get better even if you don't actually, deliberately pause, and try to figure out what's going on. Maybe just like having a better sense of what to avoid, what seems fishy. We have examples in the book where like somebody was about to fall into a huge scam and someone else just happened to see the same thing and said, this really looks fishy. They did it, in seconds, what someone else had been spending hours on without realizing it. So improve your pattern recognition and you might notice in a few seconds what's going on when, of course, there are other people who are losing money, to the exact same thing.
Great. And all these examples are in a very good context, and it just, lines up very well. So it's like all parts of the puzzle looks covered. Okay, so then my signature question. So the name of my podcast is the formula for creating value. I would like to ask Daniel's and Christopher's formula for creating value.
I think it's hard to have a formula in this context. I think one way you can think about what we're writing is a formula for avoiding losing value. Right?
Okay.
We're looking at ways of retaining value by not getting deceived. So, often I think that's come down to what we were just talking about, the idea of just pausing and asking questions that we don't tend to think about. So one of the biggest risks for losing a lot of money is time pressure and thinking you have to act now, right? And that, only one left, you got to make this purchase right now. Or, if you don't do this right now, you're going to get in all sorts of trouble. Those sorts of things almost never happen. And there's almost never that sort of time pressure to make a deal. Some rare cases, but most sort of common cases, when somebody's offering you something, it's not going to sort of vanish into the ether. And if it's a great discount, you'll probably have the same discount available at some point later. So one way to kind of retain value is to take more time for those sorts of decisions that involve a lot of value, involve a lot of money.
Great. Chris?
Dan stole my answer. Because yes, from the moment you sent this question, I was thinking, oh, well, the best way to create value is to not lose value. But I have a new take on it, which is my father did tell me that the most magical formula for creating value is called compound interest.
Okay.
And the magic of compound interest, whether it's a bank account or maybe more likely the stock market investment, mutual funds, and so on, depends on an obvious assumption, which is that your money is not all going to vanish one day, right? So we need trust in the banking system, we need trust in the companies we're working with, and so on. But we also need to not invest with fraudsters, right? So you won't be able to exploit the magic formula of compound interest if you give your money to someone who actually just steals it. So I agree with Dan, like avoiding being scammed, especially in like large things and defrauded in large things, is critical. The other thing that comes to mind when I think of the formula for creating value is, you have to do or know something different from everybody else, right? There's a huge tendency among human beings to pay attention to what everyone else is paying attention to, talk about what everyone else is talking about, read, watch, and so on, what everyone else is talking about. And there's good reasons for that, right? Probably what other people are talking about is probably important, or at least, there's a chance that it's important, right? It could be that what they're watching is high quality, right? It could be but on the other hand, you don't probably create that much value if you just copy everybody else, or at least you don't create extra value. This is probably an obvious thing to say as well, but I think of it sometimes when everyone says, oh, this is the greatest movie ever. Like, it took me like 3 decades to watch The Shawshank Redemption, which a lot of people say is the greatest movie ever and is ranked #1 on IMDb, because I just thought everyone's already seen it. Like, why do I need to see it? Everybody already knows it, like, I'll propagandize my own favorite movies, and I won't watch that one. Finally, I watched it and, I thought, oh, that was pretty good, but the #1 movie ever, so I think I was vindicated, read something different, know something different, that may lead to some extra excess value.
And don't necessarily assume that you know better than all of the other people who looked into it for a lot longer, which is the opposite of Chris's point.
Yes, of course, right. I'm not saying ignore what everyone else is doing, but just like do something different, right? Like, if you do everything different, you're probably weird. But if you do something different, you might be, adding some value to the collective as well, right? You're maybe creating value for the collective if you know something else that you can contribute, right, that they don't know already.
Yeah, great. You have to stretch. Yeah. Just on top of what everybody else does. So, guys, thank you very much. So, how would you like people to follow you, and from where they can follow you? What's the best channel for that on digital?
My website, dansimons.com, it has information about the book and other sorts of things, including links to the videos that we talked about at the beginning. So that'd be the easiest for me. Yeah, dansimons.com.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we have a Facebook page for the Invisible Gorilla that has stuff on it sometimes. You can find that. I'm on X and LinkedIn and all the usual places.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm not on X, but I'm on all the other ones.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, I can't promise that I'm putting great content out every day, but every so often I say something interesting and we post stuff about that's related to the book and our work and so on. So
awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time. It was a great pleasure.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks.
All right. Yeah. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, my name is Mete Yurtsever. I'm a design thinking and innovation facilitator, trainer, and consultant based in Istanbul. My aim is to inspire people who are working to create value in their jobs and lives through the experiences of my guests. My guests are entrepreneurs, professionals, and academicians who are experts in design thinking, behavioral psychology, innovation or creativity, who believes and advocates that the value creation in companies will be possible only through people-oriented approach to their employees and customers. The show is originally in Turkish, but I enjoy very much having guests from all around the world. If you like this episode, you can include it among your favorites, share it on social media, or even leave stars and reviews if you're listening to it on Apple. Any of these will allow these broadcasts to reach more people and, of course, will be a great motivation for me. I'll be happy to hear your comments, likes, and suggestions via LinkedIn, or you can send it an email to meta@inolabs.ist. Thank you very much for listening and your support. Stay healthy and hope to meet you in another episode.